Hello, my name is Paul Lambillion, if you've not met me before, and I'm going to speak just for a few moments about what I have termed and others have termed the bewilderment. Here we are in November 2021, and the planet and societies on the planet, countries, nations, whatever you want to call the different groups of beings that we are here in the here and now, are experiencing a very unusual time. We have the COVID pandemic, we have so-called, we have all kinds of economic issues and problems of significance flowing around us. There is the ecological and climate issue, which is occupying many minds at this time. And this period of time is something that I think we need to understand a little. Now, there are many very long and rather detailed theories, and I'm not intending in a brief presentation to be able to present every issue and every idea in a very deep and meaningful way. But I think perhaps it's worth just understanding that this period, the bewilderment, is bewildering. It is puzzling. And although we can focus on the specific issues individually, whether they're to do with health, to do with geophysical matters on the planet, whether it's to do with economics, to do with social and national issues of integrity and so on. It is a puzzling time. It is a very puzzling time, and in a way it was always likely to be like that here. I wouldn't say that it was a plan, but it is certainly a pattern that I've been aware was going to appear. I've been aware of this for some decades now, certainly going back into the 1980s. And in the 1990s, I did do a public lecture with my guidance where we spoke about this, and what they referred to it as at that time was the cleaning up of the astral plane, the changes necessary to take human beings into a new era, a new time, or as it was referred to then and still is, a new age. And this process is very much underway now. And it's important that we try to understand, at least in very basic terms, what it means to us. Is it something to be afraid of? Is it really the cataclysm to end our culture and our society? What is happening here? What is really happening, and this is part of the bewilderment, is it's sending us really on a journey. A journey that is itself a very rapidly speeding up journey, you could say, a journey where momentum is gathering very rapidly. And it's a journey of discovery of the self. Because people often speak about, for example, oh well, you know, if you change your thinking, you can change your reality. Your world is there because you've created it, and so on. This is very powerful ideas that have been around for a very long time on the planet. And to understand that and to understand what's going on, we need to have a very fundamental view of the planet, of the outer world, of the material plane, and its manifestation, and our role in that. And one of the fundamental teachings of this time is that yes, it's good to be a good steward of the planet and to honour and respect everything that grows and that is on this planet Earth. Of course that's right. And of course we should look at becoming more harmonious in our relationships with each other, whether it's with each other as individuals or whether it's each other as countries or as religions or whatever it might be. And of course we should perhaps look at new ways of supporting each other physically, economically, look at having a more harmonious, balanced and fair world and fair planet, a world of more tolerance and so on. Now, these things can't happen in isolation simply on the outside of us. What this period is really about is that every single human being who is incarnated in a body on the earth in this period, in the 2020s and 2030s, there's something changing in us. Something is growing and developing in us. And what is growing and developing in us can not really express itself in the patterns, social, economic, political, medical as well, that we have endorsed over the last 100, 200 years and more. They are no longer fitting. They no longer work for us because something is changing in all of us. Now, we may not be aware of it. Most people probably aren't really. They think that everything is happening on the outside and that in some kind of a way we're anything between an unfortunate victim or a rather culpable, bad set of beings who have lived in a very dark and evil and selfish, warlike planet. But the truth of the matter is that what is outside, what we see and experience on the outside, is simply a reflection of what is going on the inside. And there's something going on in all of us, an emergence taking place, that will ultimately lead us into a totally new understanding of what life is here for, what its purpose is, why we are here, and all of those things. And we have a choice. In fact, it's the only choice that we need to worry about, really. We have a choice as to how we progress into that new self and that new experience in what we'd envisage as a new world, a golden reality. How do we get there? And we don't do it by trying to manipulate the outer world. We don't do it by trying to control the outer world. That simply won't work. And we don't do it by continually reverting back to old practices and narrow tunnel visioned ways of looking at how we find solutions. It's a time that requires enormous creativity, people of deep inspirational vision who can begin to look at perhaps fresh and often simple ways of us making our way through this rite of passage, this period of bewilderment, into a time of greater peacefulness and harmony, because that is where ultimately our destiny lies. And so the bewilderment, this time of flux and change and incessant movement in all areas of life, is really telling us that something is changing in us and trying to change for the good of everyone, for the good of ourselves, and the good of everyone and everything that we meet. And this is happening now inside us. Now, as is often the case, the human condition has led us to want to hang on to old patterns of behaviour and thinking. This is nothing new. And we tend to resist it because we're averse to change, because we feel we might lose what we've got that is so wonderful and precious, and be left empty-handed in some obscure and unknown future. But the secret here is that we are all the future, and the future resides in us, in our consciousness, deep in our minds and in our spirits. That's where the future lies. And so what is also happening in us is a growing need to release the old prejudices, the old fears, the old hates, all of those rather limiting and frustrating mindsets and models of existence, so that we can truly allow ourselves to live from the inside outwards and not be just reactive or reverting to old programs placed in our mind over aeons and aeons of time. Now is the time for fresh thinking, for creative thinking, for the wonderful opening out of the human heart and the human soul, so that we become more loving, more creative, and let go of this tendency to wish to control everything and everybody, but simply to look at how we can unfold and understand ourselves. And for many people this is quite bewildering, because we live in a world of reductionist science, where if you can't see it in a material sense, that it's not real or it's not true, and we look for proof of this and proof of that, when in point of fact we can't really prove anything. And this change that's coming about now, which will see the intellect as something that, instead of managing what we need it to manage, it's become our master, it's become our ruler. Whereas in fact it should be the spirit in us that's the ruler. And it's that we have to surrender to, and to do the work necessary for that to happen as effectively and beautifully and wonderfully as it can. And this is the bewilderment. We have to be prepared to surrender, but not surrender to nothing, but surrender to the magnificence of our own being, the true real self. And for most people this is bewildering, because living in a world of opposites, of poles, of light and dark, of this and that, of you and me, him and her, has exaggerated the truth of our being to the point where we no longer understand it. And so the bewilderment is bewildering, but the solutions and the answers are to be found in ourselves and in anybody that watches this short film. Now, I have a few friends with me here, as I often do, have to remind me of the things that I should have said or the things that I didn't say, because I tend to do these things unscripted. But that's really a general patterning of what's happening at this time. And our security is in ourselves, it's not out here. It never was out here, but it's not in the out here, it's in the in here. And this bewilderment is gradually going to lead us into this understanding, either willingly or with resistance, but it will take us there, because there is no change in the outer world unless there's change in the inner world. So, were there any questions about that little introduction about the bewilderment and what is going on?
What can we do to help ourselves? What practical?
What can we do to help ourselves? Of course. Well, it's Paul's number one thing, as always, some kind of meditation every day. Meditation is a process of surrendering to your true self and releasing all the junk that's stored in our minds and our feelings from aeons and aeons of time that we've been on this earth. And meditation enables us to do that. That is the prime thing, because through meditation we begin to reach into the peace in ourselves. This is what we all ultimately seek, is that harmonious peace. I think to ensure that we revisit ourselves in a sense of humility, to become loving and forgiving human beings. Forgiveness is about letting go, it's about releasing the past, it's about changing our relationship to the past so that we can be more present in the moment. And so practices around that are quite important too. Things that people call today clearing, releasing, cleaning, whatever they are. They're patterns of releasing the past, of letting go of all the old programs and feelings and memories stashed up in us, so that we can become free. and to look at the world in a totally open and clearer way. So any practices to do with forgiveness, to do with opening our hearts to be more loving and kind and generous are important in that process too. The process is actually, as I often say, are quite simple. It's not anything of a great intellectual nature. It's more a question of our focus. And our focus has to be on our human family as a community. And we are all ultimately dependent on one thing, and that is our true self, our spirit, our higher nature. And so meditation, prayerfulness, reflection, becoming consciously a loving and forgiving creature who's willing to release and let go of any kind of negativity, and taking responsibility for the self. That is fundamental, that I take responsibility for me and what happens to me. I do not externalize blame, I do not point the finger at this one or that one, that I know if there's something occurring in my reality, then somehow it's expressing and creating itself through me. And so I have to try to understand that, but most important of all, I have to be prepared to release that, to let go of it, and to practice the disciplines that are quite simple, that enable us to do that. So for me, they're the kind of fundamentals of this process. As I say, it's not complicated, but it's simple, but it requires a persistence in our nature to want to do that. To be magical, as they would say, and to be wise. And it's a huge time. It's a massive time. Anyone incarnated here now, like some of my friends here have done, and I have done, and you may have done. There's something inside us that knew that it was not going to be perhaps an easy time in many respects to be here, but we also knew that we had everything in us to not only survive, but to begin to flourish in this time. And that is always true. We never have a task that we can't embrace and work through. But it's a time for practicing all the simple, beautiful ideas of love, understanding, compassion, service, forgiveness, and looking with gratitude and thanksgiving at the things that are valuable in us, which is not, as we know, the material or any of that kind. It's great to have a nice car and a nice home, of course it is. But of course, as you know, you can't take it with you when you go, as they say. And it's about being here and valuing the real things, which is the spirit of people, the love of life, the affection of your animals, the beauty of a mountain, of a forest, of a lake, the whole family of consciousness that exists. It's valuing those things and being thankful for them and changing our relationship with ourselves, and therefore changing our relationship with all that manifests around us. And it's a big task, but the methodology has been around a very long time and is in essence very simple.
Thank you.
And we're not all going to become saints overnight, but there's a nice little journey to make in that sense. And in us, it is producing conflicts, of course, because we're almost between two worlds: the world that we know is calling us, and the world that we know we have to leave behind. We can't exist in that anymore, and we have a choice. We can do it harmoniously and cooperate from the inside and trust this spiritual, wonderful creating being that we are, or we can resist it and we can fight it and we can battle with it and try to hang on to the old ways of sending our troops into a country to invade them, or robbing a bank, or whatever it is, or saying no, I'm going to store up my money in gold bars and things. Forget it, forget all of that. It's about changing something inside ourselves. There are many people, perhaps with good intentions, currently saying about a change in the world order, and yes, there will be a change in the world order, because we can't have the old one any longer. It's redundant, it doesn't work. But that change in the New World Order isn't a matter of whether we get rid of a currency and we have gold bars instead, or whether we have these people in charge. And it's not about bad guys and good guys. There's a lot of people talking about this now, the good guys and the bad guys, the black hats and the white hats, the white hats and the black hats. Well, all I can say is we are all in this together. The so-called good guys, which is after all a judgment and an opinion, nothing more than that. The bad guys, the good guys, we're all in this together. And so any doctrines, in my view, that come through saying, well, you know, if you manage to do this, you'll get lifted up into a higher level, and those that don't will be left behind, they don't understand the essence of the human soul. And that is that if one human being, one human soul is in pain or in suffering or in the darkness in their minds, then we are all in the darkness to some extent. And there's no elitism in the world of the spirit. You don't need to store up gold bars because the currency is going to go bust or anything like that, or stock markets are going to collapse or anything else. This is getting trapped in the game on the outside. And the bewilderment is telling us that playing the game on the outside gets us nowhere. Nowhere. It's always going to be me against him, her against her, this sort of thing. It gets us nowhere. What gets us somewhere is realizing that everything that is exists in me and through me, and it's the same for you. And therefore there's no question of me getting through to some high level and leaving somebody else behind to go through the same thing again, or to be fragmented into particles of nothingness. We're all in it together. And for many people this is bewildering because we've lived in such a separatist way for so long.
Can I ask, Paul, when people are watching the news, for example, and it seems to be, you know, one piece of negative or bad news after another, it can be quite panicky for some folk.
Yes,
is there a way in the moment that we can deal with that somehow?
Well, it's interesting that watching the media and the news, and the way that it reflects back on us sometimes and makes us feel insecure. Yeah, absolutely, and that we're all in a doomed passage of being. What do we do? Well, one of the things to do, of course, is to not watch the news at all. However, we have to be very careful that we don't run away from things, or that we alternatively try to fight them on the outer level. A good thing perhaps to do is, if you see the news, is to understand what's going on in some of the game out here that's being played, but to not own it, to not make it you, and to kind of say, well, I'm watching this news, or I'm reading this magazine or this newspaper. It may be true, it may not be true for me. And it actually doesn't matter whether it's true for me or not. What matters is how I respond to it, what goes on in me as a consequence of that. And if we're uncomfortable, then our job is to meditate, to pray, to practice the things necessary to release the build-up of feelings in us that are damaging and painful. The answer isn't really to turn the news off. We should be able to deal with that and manage it and not integrate it, but use it as a stimulus for getting ourselves free. And that is one way I think of doing it. Now, of course, I'm not saying watch the news 24/7 like some people do. There are better things to do than that. But denial is not always a useful way to unlock the spirit. We have to embrace what is out there. It's rather like the virus. The virus that we call, whatever it is, COVID-19 or SARS, whatever, to really work with this virus, we've got to understand that all is consciousness and all is divine consciousness. And that includes the virus. So instead of making the virus our enemy and fighting it and blocking it and all that, which will never work in the long run, in most cases, certainly not. Our task is to embrace it, to understand what it's really telling us about humanity, this virus, what it's really exposing, and to embrace it and to love it and to realize that all is part of everything else. And therefore that virus, whether it infects me or doesn't, is part of my world. And therefore I should try to understand what it's teaching me, what it's telling me about myself. And then I should practice ways of releasing that and being free from the fear and the idea that we can't all coexist harmoniously. It might sound like pie in the sky, New Age claptrap, but it's not. It's very powerful spiritual science that if all things emanate through us and from us, then we have a responsibility to manage that process and to not be the victim of it, but to be the source of beautiful change and transformation, which can be for anything, whether it's the planet and the climate change that people experience now, or whether it's to do with the virus and the pandemic. That's our responsibility. And you know, if we have a bad feeling, then the feeling is in us, it's not out there. So it's for our job to clear and release that feeling with love, with blessing, with thanksgiving, and with an openness to understand. It may seem utopian and wonderful, but why not? Wouldn't it be great to be in a beautiful world where we were disease-free, where there was no poverty, no war, no famine? Wouldn't it be wonderful to be in a world like that? And if we can imagine that to be true, it's telling us that it's possible. If anything that you can imagine in some way or another is possible, if we can imagine that golden reality, as I often call it, then it means that it's true on some level, and somehow it's possible, and somehow we will get there. That's my belief. So a little introduction on the old bewilderment, but don't be bewildered. Go and make yourself a nice cup of coffee, pour yourself a nice beer, and know that the enjoyment of that is not out here, the enjoyment of it is in here and inside you. So don't be bewildered. Recognize it's a bewildering time, but you don't have to be bewildered. You can be anything that you want to be, and you can draw in yourself more and more now. It's a great time because of the speeding up, the quickening. It's a great time to change things more quickly in the self. So there's a wonderful opportunity here for all of us in this time. I hope you found that little session useful in your own searching now, and thanks my friends from sitting here listening to me chat away, and perhaps get to speak to you at some other time.